Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into an absolutely fascinating theory from our source material regarding Donald Trump, Marco Rubio, and some really wild historical echoes of presidential succession. We're going to explore whether the current administration is operating under an entirely different set of rules than what Washington is traditionally used to.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting the apprentice theory, Rubio's expanding portfolio, a crazy historical parallel from 1814, the old Secretary of State pipeline, the King-Caucus contrast, and finally, wrap up with the idea of grooming a successor. Let's get right into it.
Our source poses this super compelling question right out of the gate. Are we essentially watching a real-life political version of The Apprentice? Because in that kind of environment, the ultimate promotion to the highest levels of power isn't just handed out because it's someone's turn, right? Instead, it has to be aggressively earned through high-stakes performance and basically surviving a grueling gauntlet of responsibilities.
Okay, part 1, the apprentice theory and learning the business. Let's really dig into this concept of learning a family trade from the absolute ground up. To understand how this works, the source recounts this very telling anecdote from one of Trump's sons. It illustrates a foundational family rule established by their father, which is that a true leader must personally learn every single job in the building. According to the story, the kids were told they had to literally sweep the floors, learn pipe fitting, and understand concrete pouring. Why? Well, because if you haven't done the job yourself, or at least intimately understood its mechanics, the people working under you are going to be able to pull the wool over your eyes. So the theory here suggests that this exact same standard of cross-training is now being applied to the highest levels of the federal government. Now take a look at the number 12. The source notes that Trump reportedly stated it takes 12 years, which is effectively 3 presidential terms, to complete his intended heavy lifting for the country. But since he is constitutionally limited to his current timeline, this strongly suggests he needs a successor to carry that torch and actually execute that 12-year vision. And doing that requires finding someone who truly, deeply knows how the whole machine operates. Which brings us to part 2, Rubio's expanding portfolio. We're looking directly at Marco Rubio, who currently finds himself the subject of all these widespread internet memes portraying him as a literal one-man federal government. The sheer accumulation of roles he's taken on in just 18 months is frankly unprecedented. The source points out that Rubio isn't just wearing one hat. He's juggling a massive workload. I mean, he's the Secretary of State, but he was also tapped as the acting administrator of USAID, the acting archivist of the United States, and the acting national security advisor. And on top of those formal titles, he's been handed the Venezuela transition, he's co-leading Iran briefings on Capitol Hill, and he's sitting at the head of the table for Russia and Ukraine strategy. It is a staggering amount of responsibility for one person.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scope of what Rubio is actually managing. He is acting as the keeper of the nation's diplomacy, its foreign aid money, its national security and war strategies, and even its historical memory through the National Archives. By taking on all of these portfolios, he is quite effectively learning every single job in the building. It's exactly like that foundational family business rule we talked about a minute ago.
Moving on to part 3, the 1814 historical parallel. Let's step back in time for a second and see how this modern dynamic echoes a wildly dramatic moment in American history. To set the scene for you, it's 1814, and Washington, D.C. is quite literally ablaze. The British have marched in, they've torched the Capitol, and they've burned the White House. The Secretary of War at the time, John Armstrong, has failed so spectacularly that he's driven out of office in absolute disgrace. He was nearly mobbed in the streets. And President James Madison finds himself a fugitive, just fleeing his own burning capital city. It is total chaos.
So, in his absolute desperation, with the very survival of the nation on the line, President Madison turns to the one man he knows can carry the water, his Secretary of State, James Monroe. Madison gives Monroe the Secretary of War job as well. As the source highlights, this is literally the only time in American history that a president has made one person fill 2 major cabinet roles simultaneously. Monroe was holding both massive portfolios at once during a time of extreme existential crisis.
And the crucial point here is that James Monroe didn't just accept the fancy titles and sit safely behind a desk in some back office. No, he took immediate action. Right before the Battle of Bladensburg, Monroe literally rode out on horseback to scout the British columns with his own eyes because he just didn't trust the intelligence reports coming in. Think about that. The Secretary of State and the Secretary of War were the same man, sitting in the same saddle, counting enemy troops. The source even notes that Monroe barely slept for 6 straight months while he managed this dual crisis.
Now, our source notes a really fascinating rhyme in history here between Madison and Monroe back then and Trump and Rubio today. During the 1808 election, Madison and Monroe were actually bitter political rivals. They had a massive falling out and stopped speaking for years. Madison brought him back into the fold later, not out of warm affection, but out of absolute necessity. The source compares this directly to the famously ugly 2016 primary between Donald Trump and Marco Rubio, where insults were just flying fiercely on the debate stage. Yet just like Madison in 1814, Trump has called upon his former fierce rival to carry an immense load for the administration.
Okay, part 4. The Secretary of State pipeline. Monroe's heroic dual-role performance ultimately made him the undisputed successor to Madison, which brings up a massive, yet largely forgotten, political tradition.
If you follow this timeline from 1801 to the 1830s, you see something amazing. Back then, highly ambitious men didn't scheme to become vice president. No way. They fought for the office of Secretary of State because it was considered an almost automatic on-ramp to the presidency. Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State was Madison, who became president. Madison's was Monroe, who became president. Monroe's was John Quincy Adams, who became president. Andrew Jackson's was Martin Van Buren, who also became president. This conveyor belt of succession was the absolute norm, right up until James Buchanan in 1857, who actually holds the title as the last Secretary of State to ever win the presidency.
Fast forward to today, however, and the source points out that this once glorious presidential on-ramp has transformed into a political cul-de-sac. It's essentially a dead end. In modern American politics, prominent figures like Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, and Colin Powell have all held the Secretary of State role. They go in, they do the job, but they don't advance to the presidency afterward. That historical escalator has completely stalled out for over 160 years.
Let's look at part 5, the King-Caucus contrast. To truly understand why this pipeline changed and why it might be reversing right now under our noses, we have to look at 2 deeply contrasting philosophies of political succession.
Our source material draws a really sharp contrast here. You have the modern establishment's philosophy, which is rooted in unearned succession, the idea that candidates are chosen simply because, well, it's their turn. Compare that directly to the moral architecture of The Apprentice. In that world, absolutely nobody is handed anything out of a sense of obligation. You have to earn the promotion through hard-fought supremacy, proving your competence under intense, unrelenting pressure.
The absolute danger of that establishment, it's their turn way of doing things, is perfectly illustrated by the 1824 King Caucus. Back in those days, presidential nominees were chosen by a small, closed-door room of congressmen. In 1824, fewer than a third of Congress even bothered to show up, and that political machine decided to nominate a man named William Crawford. Now, Crawford had recently suffered a severe stroke. He was partially paralyzed and he could barely see, but the machine picked him anyway, simply because the insiders had decided he was the groomed heir, and it was his turn.
And this brings us to Andrew Jackson, who absolutely destroyed this insider machine by taking his case straight to ordinary Americans. The American people saw the broken King Caucus system and completely rejected it. Jackson's anti-establishment playbook ended the King Caucus forever. And our source suggests that Donald Trump heavily admires this specific Jacksonian disruption, emulating that exact anti-establishment instinct to bypass party elites who try to quietly anoint successors behind closed doors.
Finally, part 6, grooming a successor. This brings us to the sweeping final analysis of what our source believes is actually happening with Marco Rubio right now on the global stage.
The source highlights a very specific strategic move. Trump allowed Marco Rubio to be the aggressive, public face of rejecting the International Criminal Court. Historically, modern secretaries of state have relied on these soft-spoken, highly diplomatic norms, carefully avoiding ruffling any international feathers. But here, Rubio is stepping completely out of that traditional mold, adopting a fierce America-first posture on the world stage. He isn't just carrying out foreign policy, he's aggressively defining it in a way that perfectly aligns with the administration's core messaging.
Look, you really can't fake what holding this immense, multifaceted workload does to a person. You either emerge from the fire as a uniquely capable leader, like James Monroe did, or you don't emerge at all. And this leaves us with one incredibly provocative question to consider. As Marco Rubio acts as the keeper of diplomacy, money, war, and memory, effectively learning every single job in the building, is history rhyming once again to reveal a heavily tested, fully groomed successor? It's a fascinating lens to view the current administration through, and it certainly leaves us wondering who will ultimately earn that final promotion. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I'll see you next time.